Since 1972, the McIlvaney Financial Group has been a conservative, contrarian investment firm. With that mindset, they have created a multifaceted approach to portfolio management, offering a wide array of services including wealth management, a unique short fund, hedging through precious metals, and excellent educational resources. We have had David McIlvaney on our show multiple times because we respect his outlook, viewpoints, and recommendations. You really need to let them give you a much better understanding of what true portfolio diversification is. Just go to McIlvaney.com/Main Street, with Main Street all spelled out, to get introduced and to garner free information. Again, that's McIlvaney.com/Main Street to schedule your free 20-minute consulting session. Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest, but I've been following his work for years. He is one of the more popular websites about the economy now. He's the publisher of the popular Economic Collapse blog. He's written a novel, The Beginning of the End. He's a former attorney and lobbyist in D.C., and he's also very strongly considering running for Congress in Idaho in 2018. Michael Snyder, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on, Jason. It's a real honor.
Yeah, and I've been following your work for years, Michael. You put out a lot of articles covering reality of the economy. You've made Zero Hedge, years ago. Your articles are routinely published on there. So congratulations on that. I've seen you, on a lot of big name programs as well. And you're telling me before the show started, before we started recording, how, you built up the blog basically from scratch to this enormous level of popularity now.
Yeah, so if anybody out there is saying, well, what could I do to make a difference? How could I ever, do what these guys are doing? Well, everyone starts small, and you don't want to despise small beginnings because, when I first started, years and years ago, when I first started writing, I had to even learn what blogging was at first. And then, I started, and you could have, measured my audience with a microscope, but I stuck with it and I stuck with it. And now today, between the Economic Collapse blog, endoftheamericandream.com, the most important news.com, my websites have been viewed well over 100 million times, just my websites. And then, of course, my articles are on dozens and dozens of other websites, some much, much larger than my own, where they're actually read far more off of my websites than on my website. So the readership beyond of what I get is, the numbers are so astronomical, I can hardly believe it, but it's not because I'm special, but it's the power of an ordinary person and the freedom the internet gives us, because before, the mainstream media were always the gatekeepers of news and information, but the internet has allowed us and the alternative media to get our message out there. And so just an ordinary person like me and my wife living up in the mountains of Idaho, in the middle of nowhere, we can literally touch the entire planet through our writing and the various things we do. And it's really a remarkable thing.
Now, let's talk about a lot of the articles that you've put out. I think you cover the real economy better than the mainstream media. According to the Federal Reserve, according to Janet Yellen, according to the mainstream financial media, there's still GDP growth, there's still job creation. The economy is doing pretty well, although they wished it was doing better. Even Trump now has started to take credit for the stock market going higher, and he's saying all these jobs are being created. What's the reality of the situation of the American economy, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the economy, because the economy, of course, Barack Obama was the only president in U.S. history never to have a single year when the U.S. economy grew by at least 3%. And he had 2 terms to try to do that, 8 years, and he couldn't get it done, not even a single year. And so we've been in this long period of essentially no growth, even though they, try to boost the numbers with their seasonal, additions and how they massage the numbers and they, all the things they do to boost the numbers artificially. There's still the economic growth has been pathetic, and it has been for an extended period of time. So when I'm talking about economic collapse, I'm not just talking about some future event, but I'm talking about a process that's been going on over decades. So let's just look at the past decade, Jason. Over the past decade, I was thinking about it. I thought, economic growth has been so poor. Let me take a look at what it's been over the past decade. And so I went back and I looked at all 10 years, and I divided them by 10, and I found out that the average rate of economic growth in this country over the last 10 years has just been 1.33%. I thought, wow, that's horrible. For a whole decade, 1.33%, that is absolutely terrible. And so then I said, well, let me compare this to other periods in American history and see how that compares. So I went back to the 1930s and, the Great Depression in the 1930s. And I went through and I looked at each of those 10 years, added them up, divided by 10. And you know what I found? I found that for the 1930s, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the average economic growth on a yearly basis in the 1930s was 1.33%, exactly equal. And I thought, that can't be right. How could I get the exact same number for both time periods? So I went back and totally redid the numbers completely from scratch again, and I came up with the exact same thing. It turns out, Jason, our economic growth over the last 10 years has been exactly equal to the economic growth that the United States had in the 1930s, the worst decade in our history. So anyone that says the economy's been doing fine, I would take issue with. And then, of course, during the first quarter, initially came the GDP growth for the first, and we're supposedly doing better now. Well, economic growth in the first quarter came in at less than 1%. Then it was revised up to 1.2%, which is a little bit below the rate of the previous 10 years. And then it looks like for the second quarter, we might be at slightly higher in the same range, but overall it's not going well in terms of economic growth. And of course, then if you look at specific industries right now, the retail industry, and this year, so far, more than 300 retailers have already filed for bankruptcy this year, already surpassed the total for all of last year. But then if you look at the number of store closings, Jason, we're on pace to break the all-time record that was set during the last, financial crisis. We're on pace to break the all-time record for store closings in this country, and we're on pace to shatter it by more than 20%. We're not just going to break it by a little bit. We're just going to shatter the record. So it's a retail apocalypse. Malls all over the country are shutting down. In fact, it's being projected that in the next 5 years, 25% of all malls in the country are going to shut down. Or if you look at the retail industry, the auto industry. The auto industry is having their worst year since the last recession. Sales are down for almost all the major automakers. Huge problems, very, very troubling. And another thing to watch for, people need to be watching for this, is the yield curve, where the yield curve is flattening, and we are potentially heading for what's known as an inverted yield curve. And if that happens, we've seen this happen before every single recession since 1960. Every single time the yield curve is inverted, we've had a recession, never failing. And so we're headed there quite rapidly now. And if we get there, that's, in my mind, it's essentially going to guarantee another recession. And so we've got all these problems, to such a large degree, we've never even recovered from the last time around. For example, right before the last recession, there were 26 million Americans on food stamps. Today, there are still 44 million Americans on food stamps, even though supposedly the recession's been over for quite some time. But yet we've had this permanent increase in poverty and those that need government assistance. So there's all kinds of trouble signs. We've never even really had a recovery. We've never had, like I mentioned earlier, a year when we even have had 3% growth. And now it looks like we're moving toward another downturn, Jason.
Yeah, I completely agree with a lot of your insights there. You said a lot, so I'll try to go back through some of the stuff you said, and we'll unpack it a little bit more. I think, there wasn't a real recovery on Main Street after the 2008 financial crisis. I think, a lot of the recovery was just in asset prices, with regular stocks, real estate, the bond market. So the central banks now, in order to prop those things back up, you're seeing really Orwellian levels of intervention in markets by not only the Federal Reserve, which has over 4.4 trillion on its balance sheet, but the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England even has over $3 trillion on its balance sheet, and the People's Bank of China, which China even did a $28 trillion in RMB credit bubble to try to stimulate their economy. They're going to have to pay the piper too. But I think the real economy, Michael, you brought up a good point there about the 1930s. I think there's an argument to be made that, the GDP is hiding how the rot of how much worse the economy is now than the 1930s, because it's underestimating a lot of the inflation that's occurring now. I don't know if you've heard of Ed Butowski of the Chapwood Inflation Index, but I'm on his website right now, and it's talking about how there's been over 10% inflation in all the major U.S. cities for the last 5 years. So if you add in, a real inflation rate, whether you want to use John Williams of Shadow Stats or the Chapwood Inflation Index numbers, you're looking at a lot worse economy than there was in the 1930s, because there are no jobs created now, and then there's higher costs and inflation on top of that.
Oh, absolutely. You're 100% on the ball there, because and the way inflation has been calculated has been changed over and over and over again since the 1970s to make it look lower officially. But if we used honest numbers, and I love John Williams of shadowstats.com, he tracks what these different numbers would look like if honest numbers were being used. And according to his calculations, US GDP would have continuously been negative since 2005 if honest numbers were being used. So if honest numbers were being used, we may be talking about the recession that has never ended for essentially over a decade. What we have is this very long period of economic stagnation, where in 2015, for the first time ever, the middle class became a minority in this country. And that's the first time it ever happened. While back in the 1970s, well over 60% of all Americans were middle class. But now, when you add up all the wealthy people and our growing ranks of the poor, they outnumber the middle class. So our middle class is steadily shrinking. It's declining. It's not as vibrant as it once was, because the good jobs are disappearing. They're being shipped overseas. Manufacturing jobs are being shipped overseas. They're being replaced by service jobs. And so, as you said, inflation's going up, the cost of living's going up, paychecks are stagnating or going down. So just normal families are being squeezed like never before. And not too long ago, there was a survey by Career Builder that found that 75% of all Americans said that they live paycheck to paycheck at least some of the time. And I just did an article just this week, which talked about how 69% of all Americans do not have an adequate emergency fund. And so all these different surveys, what they're basically telling us is that people are hurting. They don't have a cushion to fall back on. They're just scraping by, so many people in this country. And the middle class is shrinking. And so many are just hanging on to the middle class by their fingernails, just like in 2008. When all of a sudden the financial markets crashed, millions of people started losing their jobs because they didn't have anything to fall back on. Well, then they couldn't pay the mortgage. We saw mortgage defaults go through the roof, foreclosures went crazy. And all kinds of people fell out of the middle class, and a lot of them, were out on the street pretty rapidly. Well, the same thing is going to happen this time around.
And the government numbers, the CPI, which tracks their method of inflation, says inflation is below 2%. Janet Yellen was recently, last week, when she raised interest rates again, talking about how, inflation is not a major threat, and saying, there's not a lot of unemployed. But you also put out another article recently, Michael, about the birth-death model, saying that the birth-death model has created most of the jobs since the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah. When and this is one of the things they do to pump up the numbers. This birth death model. They have all these models and assumptions they put into the numbers, and in terms of job creation. And when that model alone accounts for almost all the increase, almost all of it, of the increase that we've seen in job creation and the number of jobs added to the economy, since the last recession. And that's just a kind of a number that's estimated, that's pulled out. It's not really a measurement of anything. It's just an assumption. And so, a lot of times we hear, such and such number of jobs were created, but people don't understand all the assumptions and how things are a lot of times just pulled out of thin air and thrown into the calculation. But the reality of the matter is, well, one thing I like to look at is the employment population ratio. In other words, it's a measurement of the working age population, the percentage of them that actually have a job. And right before the last recession, it was hit at 63%. And then if you look at the chart during the recession, it plunged dramatically from 63% to below 59%. And now since that time, for a while, it stayed between 58 and 59%, and now it's gotten back to about 60%, but we're still way below the 63% that we were at previously. So it's like we've lost 3% there permanently in terms of the percentage of the working age population that is actually employed. Meanwhile, the official, unemployment rate, that has gone way down. But the way they do that is they take huge chunks of people that were unemployed and they say, well, they've been out of a job so long, we're not going to count them as unemployed anymore. We're going to say they're not in the labor force, which doesn't count against the official employment number. And so, in terms of the number, when you add the two groups together, the officially unemployed and those that are considered to be, quote, not in the labor force, well, it's been hovering around 102 million Americans that do not have a job for quite some time now. So our employment situation, yeah, it's maybe marginally improved since the depths of the last recession, but not that much. And we've certainly never even gotten close to getting back to the 63% of working age Americans that are employed that we were at before the last recession. Never even come close. So, for people think that we fully recovered, no, not even close.
One thing, Michael, that I haven't heard a lot of other people talk about is that, when Ben Bernanke, when he was Federal Reserve Chairman after the 2008 financial crisis, when the Federal Reserve, other members of the Fed, when the government jobs numbers would come out after the 2008 financial crisis for years, they would talk about all the jobs that were created in restaurants and retail. I heard this ad nauseum. I think I at least heard this 100 times over, since the 2008 financial crisis, how all these great jobs in restaurants and retail were. Well, you've been covering this retail apocalypse now. So if there were lots of jobs, and let's assume there were some jobs created, I think a lot of them were part-time jobs. But, those jobs that were created, aren't they being destroyed now that the consumer, with inflation, with the lack of a full-time job, doesn't have discretionary income to go out and spend extra money at the mall or go out to eat a couple times a week at a restaurant?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing with all these the big retailers shutting down stores, laying off workers. Now, retail jobs are not good jobs anyway. I mean, you can't support a middle-class family on a retail job. You can't support a middle-class family on a restaurant job. So these are not good jobs we're talking about anyway. But yeah, now with, in terms of thousands of stores being closed down all over the country this year, we're seeing, job losses in the retail industry, and they weren't good jobs in the first place. So yeah, it's very alarming. But I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier about the central bank intervention, because a lot of people, they don't know these numbers we're talking about. All they see is, stock market is near record high. That must mean the economy is doing well. But no, that's not the case at all. Because basically what's been driving the financial markets, and it's for years now, is since the last financial crisis, central banks have intervened on a scale we've never seen before in history, where they've accumulated trillions and trillions of dollars on their balance sheets. What they've done is pump trillions of dollars in the financial system, buying bonds, but also buying stocks. And so this is one of the things that has driven up stock prices. For example, the Swiss National Bank, that's the central bank in Switzerland, and during the months of January, February, and March, those 3 months alone, they bought 4 million shares of Apple stock. Now, of course, Apple stock was going to go up because it doesn't matter if I buy a few shares, you sell a few shares. That's not going to influence the price when you've got a central bank buying 4 million shares in just 3 months. It's just crazy. Or also the Swiss National Bank in Facebook, they're a huge investor in Facebook. In fact, at this point, they own more publicly traded shares of Facebook than Mark Zuckerberg does. Now, Mark Zuckerberg has some other shares of a different class that enables him to maintain control of Facebook. But talking publicly traded shares, the Swiss National Bank owns more than Mark Zuckerberg does. Or you look at the Bank of Japan, where the Bank of Japan has just been shameless. They just buy everything over there. I mean, the stock market in Japan at this point is a total sham. And so they've gone in and bought so many shares. They're now a top 5 owner in more than 80 of the biggest companies in Japan. And they're on pace to become the #1 owner in more than 50 of them by the end of this year, I believe. And so, yeah, if central banks keep buying stocks at this rate, well, eventually they're going to own everything. I mean, it's just going to be, virtually everything. It's just going to get to the point where it's already at the point where it's absurd. But, it's not a free market anymore, because when you let central banks just create money out of thin air and just go buy whatever stocks they want to buy, basically play God and inflate the markets whenever they want. It's not a market anymore. It's not a free market. It's a total shell game, and it's completely ridiculous. But what they've done is they've created this giant bubble, which price earnings ratios are so way out of whack at this point. Just to get back to where they would make sense, to get back to the long-term average, stock prices would have to fall at least 40 or 50% from the current level, just to get to a point where they would be rational again, where they would make sense again. Eventually, I believe at some point that will happen. But for now, these central banks have pumped up this bubble for a really long time, and they continue to buy. Although the Federal Reserve is now talking about unwinding their balance sheet, and if they start doing that and other central banks start doing the same, well, the process that inflated the stock market bubble will also crash it. And so, and of course, if it happens now, it's going to look like it's Trump's fault, even though it won't be, but it would be very bad for Trump. And could that be what they may be intending? Could this be a political move by the Federal Reserve to raise rates? During the Obama era, they pushed rates all the way to the floor. Now they're raising rates. Now they're talking about unwinding their balance sheet. Could there be political motivations behind what the Federal Reserve is now doing? I don't know.
Most of the people who are governors at the Federal Reserve are hardcore Democrats. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility that they could do this. But yeah, the markets, they're Orwellian, they're dystopian. It's hardcore fascism with this intervention by central banks. Because, you can't predict when the markets are going to collapse if the central banks are going to keep changing the rules, and they're going to keep taking turns with enormous amounts of asset purchases. And the Federal Reserve hasn't even done that many asset purchases, according to them, although there's something I found out about from a source that was at a secret IMF meeting in 2014, that there was, tens of trillions in currency swaps that are still being injected and pulled out at will into the economy, into asset markets, to stop, derivatives from exploding. But, there's been over $1.5 trillion in asset purchases from the other central banks, from the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. We don't know what China's buying, and we know they're going to have to do bailouts too. So this is, I say welcome to dystopia, kind of like Who is John Galt? These are just, they're making up the rules as they go. And every time, Michael, that, you're a guy from Main Street, you worked here in DC, but you're a guy of the people. You're a normal, regular guy. I've seen you speak before. It's not fair what they're doing, and you think you know the rules, and then they go and change them so it only benefits people in DC or people on Wall Street or large corporations.
Exactly. And so the only reason financial markets are as high as they are is because of this intervention by central banks. And if they were to remove that intervention, and by now we would have had a horrible crash without their intervention. And if they remove that intervention now, the crash is going to be even bigger because the bubble's even bigger because of their intervention. But a similar thing could be said about, in terms of government spending, where during the Obama era, when he became president, we were $10.6 trillion in debt. Now we're nearly $20 trillion in debt. During his 8 years, more than $9 trillion was added to the national debt. Now that's stealing consumption from the future and bringing it into the present. And when the government spends money, it gets into the pockets of people, and then they go spend it on housing and food and clothing, different things that they need. And so there's a multiplying effect, but let's even ignore that for a second. If you would have removed from the economy $9 trillion of government spending over the last 8 years, if just remove that, we would be in a rip-roaring depression right now. So, because government spending boosts the economy in the short term, but of course there's a long-term price to pay for that. And what we're doing to future generations of Americans is absolutely criminal. We continue to steal about $100 million an hour, every single hour of every single day from future generations of Americans, through the instrument of government debt. And so that's, and I don't know why more people don't get upset about that. But basically, if as bad as our economic growth has been, where it's averaged 1.33% over the last 10 years, if you remove all that money that we didn't have, that we had to go borrow, we spent all of this money we didn't have, more than $9 trillion, you remove that from the economy, and this past decade would have been the worst decade by far for the U.S. economy in our entire history.
But maybe that would have been a good thing, though. Maybe we would have had a recovery already by now. I believe in capitalism and free markets. I believe in bankruptcy and failure, and we had none of that. We had people who committed basically crimes with the robo documents and mortgage fraud, and none of the bankers went to prison. The Obama administration, not only did Obama double the debt, like you said, I mean, he destroyed rule of law. Rule of law was already being eroded with the Patriot Act, which was signed in, and no one even read it when they signed it in. So our civil liberties were being destroyed and freedoms were being destroyed by then. But Obama really ramped things up on separating the elites, the political and economic elites, from being able to basically do whatever they want, because he had protection from Comey and the other people in the Department of Justice with Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. So, I didn't vote for Trump, but I'm hoping, that now that he's fired Comey, maybe he'll bring in someone who's more qualified, who will listen to the rule of law. And, I think Trump is trying to do a few good things. But he's also, it's a mixed bag with Trump. What are your opinions then on some of the things that Trump has done so far?
Well, I voted for Trump, and I support the things he ran on now, and some of the things he's been able to do, a few things through executive orders, but most of what he wants to do is blocked because it has to go through Congress. So, for example, Obamacare repeal, in 2016, the Republicans got an Obamacare repeal to Obama's desk, a clean Obamacare repeal, which he, of course, vetoed. But why can't they pass that same bill and get it to Trump's desk? But instead, no, we can't do that. And so they've got this giant mess. They're probably not going to be able to get it through the Senate. And it's not free market in any way, shape, or form what they want to do. And that's what we need to do with everything. I'm a big believer in free markets, too. We need to rebuild our healthcare system based on free market principles and to completely rebuild it from the ground up. But that's not what the Republicans have in mind at all. They just kind of want to patch up what we're currently doing. And that's ultimately not going to work. It would be a slightly less big of a disaster than we have now, but you take a massive disaster and make it slightly less worse, well, you still have a disaster. Yep. But so that hasn't been able to get through. Trump wanted to reduce taxes. That hasn't been able to get through. Trump has been able to do a little bit in terms of reducing regulation through executive orders, but the big reducing of regulations and so forth would, or eliminating government programs, government agencies, that would have to come through Congress. That's being blocked. I mean, the wall is being blocked by Congress. You could just go on and on and on. Things that are being blocked by Congress. So Congress is the problem. And there's a reason why, according to Real Clear Politics, right now it has an average approval rating of just 17.6%. In presidents, they're usually up around the 40, 50, maybe 60% range in terms of approval rating. But Congress is typically down in this range because people are sick and tired of Congress. They can't get anything done. They're corrupt. And we've got this kind of permanent ruling class of career politicians, because we don't have term limits, which we desperately need, but they stay in there for decades. All they care about is their big donors. They care about the special interests. They don't care about the American people, and we need to clear them out. We need some fresh leadership, some fresh thinkers to go in and to get things turned around.
Yeah, and also, Michael, the people in Congress now, they spend all their time trying to raise money to stay in office or working on, secret backdoor deals to either get IPO stock options like Nancy Pelosi or cushy jobs on board of director seats when they leave the stock option, but when they leave their congressional posts, but they don't even read the bills they sign anymore. Obamacare wasn't read by people who signed it into law, and the same thing with the Patriot Act. It's just really, we're in theater of the absurd Twilight Zone territory here now. It's totally dystopian how crazy, these laws really affect people's lives. Obamacare was, hurting a lot of families' bills. Their healthcare bills exploded even more than their healthcare bill was more each month than their mortgage for a lot of families. And yet here, the people in Congress, they didn't even read the bill that affected people's lives so much.
Oh, you're right. And Al Franken recently came out with a book in which he admitted that as a senator, that he often spends 3 hours a day on the phone raising money. That's what he does with his days. But because that's what they're concerned about. They're concerned about their next election, raising money, instead of reading bills, doing the work that the American people sent them there to do. So, I mean, Congress is a cesspool of filth and corruption. It desperately needs to be cleaned up, And ultimately, I would like to see not just term limits. I would love to see where all members of Congress, every member of the House, every member of the Senate, is limited to just one term. That way we get rid of these career politicians. We get people who actually want to go there, do a job, and then they're not worried about the next election because there is no next election. And then we get a constant wave of fresh thinkers and fresh ideas coming in.
That's an interesting idea. Originally the founding fathers, people really only wanted to do their work for government for one term for the most part because they couldn't get a huge salary working the system and working for Congress. So they would only go, when there was important votes in the past to, DC, and then they would go back home because they had to earn a living from a regular job. But, once I think it's around the progressive era, around World War I, when the politicians in Congress started to really, increase their annual salary and start giving themselves all these Cadillac healthcare plans and bonuses, and it's increased a lot.
Yeah, and what happens is then control freaks tend to be drawn to politics and to big government because that's kind of their ultimate dream. If you're a control freak, and then you can control everyone, control the entire country. Well, that's what you love. So all these control freaks are drawn to government, and they want to make government bigger and bigger and bigger constantly. But the bigger government gets, then every time the government gets bigger, liberty and freedom are reduced, because today on the federal level, there's hundreds of thousands of laws and rules and regulations. And when you add in state and local and city and, everything else, we have millions of laws and rules and regulations that govern our lives today in this country. And it's kind of the opposite of what our founding fathers intended, because our founding fathers intended a nation where freedom and liberty are maximized. Yeah, we don't want anarchy. We're always going to have certain laws. For example, it's good to have a law that says do not murder, because we don't want to have the freedom to go around randomly killing one another. So do not murder is a good law, but we want to have a small government, limited amount of laws, and maximize freedom and liberty, for people to live their lives. And that's where the free market comes in. We want to have a free market. Take the shackles off. The free market works. In fact, Jason, we haven't even covered this today, but if you go back between 1872 and 1913, there was no central bank, so no Federal Reserve. There was no income tax and no IRS. So you go back to those days, and was it a total disaster? No. Between 1872 and 1913 was the greatest period of economic growth in U.S. history. The free market was allowed to do its thing. We thrived. It was, America did great and became a major economic power during that time. And that's what we need to do again, one of the reasons why I am very, very, very strongly leaning toward running for Congress here in Idaho's 1st Congressional District is because I want to go and undo the work of the control freaks, tame this monster that the federal government has become, return power to the states, go to a much, much more limited government as our founding fathers intended. So I would abolish the EPA. I would abolish the Department of Education. I would abolish the BATFE, for example, which is very abusive. I would abolish the income tax. I would abolish the IRS. I would abolish the Federal Reserve and return power to the people, free up the free enterprise system, free markets to do their thing. Yeah, we're always going to need a federal government for national defense and for certain purposes. But this is a country, we're supposed to be the land of the free. We need to start becoming that once again.
And I think, I agree with cutting back government, limited government. I don't want to see any more inflation. Unfortunately, Michael, I think the more intervention we see from central bankers and politicians, the more inflation and taxes we're going to have. I see, unless they get out of the way, we're going to have a lot worse stagflation going forward. I don't think, the GDP, the CPI, the jobs numbers are going to reflect the reality like you cover in your articles. But I think the reality of this situation is, and you've covered this with your article about Illinois, how they're starting with pension fund shortfalls. They're going to their bureaucrats there just say, well, we'll just tax the people more to make up for the pension shortfalls. Well, people are going to move out of Chicago. They're going to leave the state of Illinois. They're not going to put up with this, 33% tax increase. So, these politicians and bureaucrats and central bankers, they think that they could just keep increasing inflation and taxes on us, and that, people just sit there and take it.
Yeah, and when government keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, taxes have to keep increasing, and it's just not an income tax. There are literally, I did an article one time where I listed 97 different taxes that are imposed on the American people every year. So our politicians have become masters at finding different ways to extract money from us, not just through the income tax, but literally dozens of different ways, and a lot of them are hidden taxes, hidden fees, and that we could do a whole program on that. But you mentioned inflation, Jason, and we've become so accustomed to, oh yeah, prices just go up every year. This is what happens because we've been living it for so long. We think, well, this is just how it's supposed to work. But before 1913, we did not, the United States never had a persistent problem with inflation. But then the Federal Reserve came in. And since the Federal Reserve was created, the value of the US dollar has declined by approximately 98%. And some would say even more. But because the Federal Reserve was designed to create this government debt spiral from which it could never possibly escape. So they're constantly rising government debt, which means that also taxes would have to keep going up. Originally when the income tax came in, most Americans were taxed at a rate of just 1%. But, we see now where it's completely out of control. And so always taxes getting bigger, government getting bigger, government debt constantly getting bigger. And since the Federal Reserve was created, the size of the U.S. national debt has gotten more than 5,000 times larger. So the Federal Reserve is actually working perfectly for what it was originally designed to do. Now, it's fundamentally flawed because it's destroying our economy and our financial system. But for the bankers designed it to get the government in debt and to create this debt spiral that would never end and constantly get bigger, they've achieved that. So, and they've achieved the goal of destroying our currency. And, the system is so insane. This is why we can't just reform the system. We've got to shut down the Fed and start over with non-debt-based currency and get out of this government debt spiral. But you know what, Jason? It's not just the United States. Today, more than 99% of the population of the world lives in a country with a central bank. So even though we can't get the whole world to agree on anything, somehow the whole world has somehow agreed that central banking, this debt-based system, is the way to go. It's absolute lunacy.
Yeah, and if central banking with debt-based currency and secret bailouts and, create credit basically out of thin air, you're talking about the Swiss central bank. They created that money out of thin air to go buy the assets. They didn't work their ass off to go earn that money to go buy those assets. They just created the money. They were running a euro peg initially to try to keep their Swiss franc currency from strengthening too much. So they were, printing up Swiss francs to buy euros, and that ballooned their their trade holdings. So then they started buying assets like crazy. But, the people on Main Street, the middle class is being destroyed from all this. So hopefully it's not too late. I want to ask you some solutions, though, since, you identify a lot of the problems with your articles. What are your opinions for solutions for people on Main Street to, save themselves from stagflation, figure out ways to increase their income, cut back their debt? What are some solutions that, since you've been studying this problem for years now?
Yeah, on a personal level, I guess I have some bad news for people in that every giant financial bubble, every giant debt bubble, every stock market bubble in all of history has always ended badly. And this one's going to end badly too, even if they can keep it going for a little while longer. At some point, it's going to end and it's going to be really bad. So you need a cushion to fall back on. I recommend at least 6 months of an emergency fund to fall back on, so that if you lose a job, things don't go well, at least you have money to pay the mortgage, to pay your bills, to put food on the table. And whatever you can do to become independent of the system, whether it's starting up a side business, learning how to grow a garden, storing up emergency food and supplies. And in my book, Get Prepared Now, I go into a whole bunch of different things you can do. But whatever you can do to become more independent of the system, to weather the coming storm, you need to do it because it's coming. Now, ultimately, beyond that, beyond the storm, hopefully this time around, hopefully the American people will finally understand that our system, just patching things together like we did last time, that's not going to work. Our system is fundamentally flawed, whether you're talking about the Federal Reserve and so on, where we need to completely change the system, rebuild it from the ground up, go to a non-debt-based system, a non-debt-based currency, and totally change the way that we do things in this country. And then ultimately beyond that, we need to go back to the things that once made the U.S. Economy great in the first place. And that's free markets, free enterprise, small business, entrepreneurs, where the percentage of Americans that are self-employed today is hovering near all-time low. That's horrible. We need to totally reverse that trend, where we want people to work for themselves, to start businesses, to be entrepreneurs. And that means getting the regulations and the red tape and the taxes off their backs, totally rethink the way that we think about taxation in this country, totally think about rethink the way of, swing the pendulum from super over-regulated completely back in the other direction, so that we can, because it's not the government's not going to solve our problems. Government is the problem. We need to get the government off of our backs, to take the shackles off the free market system, because the free market system works if you allow it to.
Amen, Michael. Unfortunately, Michael, I think way too many Americans, want the government to help them. They like socialism. If you look at the polls, I'm Generation X, but a lot of millennials don't even like the word capitalism or free markets. A lot of them prefer socialism. So, until this mindset or ideology is changed, it's going to be an uphill battle.
I think so, and that's why what you're doing is so important, Jason. What all of us are doing in the alternative media, where it's a second American Revolution, but not one with guns and bullets, but we're literally in a battle for hearts and minds, and we're winning one heart and one mind at a time. And we're building an army of people that are awake, that understand these things, and ultimately, but it's not just enough to build this army. But what we've got to do is retake the power structures in our country, and once we retake these power structures in our country, and I'm talking about the legal system, the education system, state, local government, federal government, all the positions of power and decision making in our society, and start moving us in a different direction. And so, and that's kind of the next stage, because for a long time, the alternative media has been waking people up. And this is one of the reasons I'm running for Congress, because if we want things to change, well, the people who are in positions of power right now aren't listening to us. So we've not got to kick them out, move in, and not just take positions of government power, but like I said, the legal system is a major, major deal. We need good people. We need good people to be judges, good people to take positions of power in the legal system, and in education, which is very dominated by the progressive orthodoxy of the day. Throughout our society, we need to start making changes. So people have got to get off of the sofa, off the couch, get out there and start making a difference.
Yeah, I just finished Judge Andrew Napolitano's book, Lies the Government Tells You, and he talks about all the problems in the legal system, if our listeners want to go read that book. But yeah, the legal system is a major, major problem, and, a lot of corrupt criminals and lawyers like Obama and Holder and Loretta Lynch and Comey have been running the legal system for way too long. So the rule of law for a lot of regular, ordinary Americans, the laws don't favor them. For middle-class people. But I want to thank you again for your time, Michael. I really enjoyed this discussion. And if our listeners want to follow more of your work, how do they do so?
Yeah, the website I'm primarily known for is theeconomiccollapseblog.com, or just go to Google and type in the economic collapse. It'll be the first result that comes up. You can also find other articles addressing a wider variety of issues on endoftheamericandream.com. And if you can find all my articles gathered in a single place on themostimportantnews.com. And on all those websites, you'll find banners that will take you to Amazon.com, where you can find my books. I've got a new book coming out in a couple weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And then also you'll want to keep an eye out for, like I said, I'm very strongly considering running for Congress here in Idaho's 1st Congressional District. And people want to keep a watch out for an announcement in that regard in the very near future.
And we didn't get to talk about robotics and automation, which is something that you've also covered. So we'll have to do that on the next interview.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's always more to talk about, Jason, without a doubt.
Wall Street for Main Street needs your help. YouTube stole $7,200 from Wall Street for Main Street in annualized YouTube AdWords revenues, and they kneecapped our analytics down by more than 80% across the board since September 2016 with their new censorship algorithms to stop the rapid growth of our channel. That was money we could have used to upgrade our website, pay bills, and invest in improving our content and growing our business. Our audience of loyal listeners is all over the globe and so large now that if most or all of our listeners were to commit to donating $1 to $5 each month to our Patreon account, we could easily meet our goal on Patreon. Wall Street for Main Street also accepts one-time donations on our main wallstreetformainstreet.com website. That's WALLSTFORMAINST.com website via PayPal, Gold Money, or Bitcoin. We also accept donations of physical precious metals that can be mailed to us. Thanks to all listeners who have already made a donation, and thanks in advance to any listeners who make a future donation or contribution to the growth, improvement, and success of Wall Street for Main Street.